The first scream came just after the door slammed behind him. She didn't make a sound when the midwife turned and told her he was gone. Didn't cry when the wagon that took him never came back down the mountain road. Didn't even flinch when the women in town whispered that she ought to remarry quick before the freeze came down and left her and the baby to die in that crooked shack he'd barely finished building. But when her belly clenched with pain for the first time, sharp and deep like something ripping inside her, that's when she finally let it out. Not for the pain, not for the baby, not even for herself. It was because she knew the walls wouldn't hold, not through what was coming. The shack moaned with every wind that howled down the gulch that night. Boards rattled like bones in a coffin. Snow slipped through every crack and landed on the blankets piled over her shoulders. It melted slow, too slow. She was soaked and shivering before midnight. The lantern flickered once, then again, then out. She curled around her belly, teeth clenched, biting hard into a scrap of leather so the town wouldn't hear her scream again. If they did, they'd come. And if they came, they'd take her baby, just like they said they would. They already didn't think she was fit, already whispered it was unnatural, the way she lived alone up here, how she still talked to him in the evenings when the sky turned red behind the ridge. She didn't have a name anymore, not to them, just the girl from the mine road, or that one who'd lost her man and still ain't right. She'd walked into town twice since he died, once to buy salt, once for a spool of thread. No one looked her in the eye either time. One man told her she ought to pray more. A woman handed her a shawl with a cold smile, then whispered to her friend something about a womb full of curses. No one said what they meant, but she saw it in their faces. They thought she was bad luck. They thought the baby wouldn't survive, that she wouldn't. Maybe they even hoped it, but she'd made a promise. On her knees in the dirt next to his grave, no marker, just a stone and a ring she left buried beside him. She'd sworn to keep the baby safe, even if she had to vanish to do it. And that's what she did. The morning after that first pain, after the screams had left her raw, and the cold nearly robbed her of breath, she didn't sit by the fire trying to warm herself. She didn't lie down and hope the neighbors would change their minds. She wrapped what food she had in an old flour sack, filled a tin with water from the bucket that had half frozen by the door, and stepped out into the snow with a blanket around her shoulders and a broken lantern in her hand. And she walked toward the mine. It wasn't just any mine. It was their mine, the one he'd worked until his lungs filled with dust and his back bent too far to straighten. The one they'd shut down a year before when the last shaft caved and the company pulled out with every dollar that ever passed through that rock. The mouth was boarded, the road grown over. Folks said it was cursed, too many dead men under the earth. But that's why she picked it. No one would follow her there. No one would dare. It took her most of the day to reach it. By the time she stood in front of the slanted wood frame and half-rotted support beams, her fingers were bleeding from the cold and her legs trembled every time she shifted her weight. But she didn't stop, didn't cry, just dropped to her knees and clawed at the boards with both hands until one snapped free with a scream of splinters. Inside, it was worse than she remembered. The tunnel yawned like a black throat. Damp air oozed out with the stink of rot and rust. Bats somewhere deep made a sound like tiny screams. She pressed her hand to her belly. The baby kicked once, hard. "I know," she whispered. "It's not a home, but it's all we've got." She didn't go far at first, just enough to get past the entrance, enough to crouch inside where the snow wouldn't find her. She leaned against the wall and sat there a long time, listening to the old mountain groan and shift overhead like it was thinking about collapsing. But it didn't, not that day. By nightfall, she had dragged in an old crate from behind the tool shed, split it with a rusted axe head she found buried under rock, and made a fire just inside the tunnel mouth. The light flickered like a candle in a grave, but it gave her enough to see the rafters. They were still holding. That night she didn't scream, even when the pains came harder, even when her breath caught so sharp she thought her chest would split. She bit into her wrist, hard enough to bleed, and stared into the fire until the pain blurred into heat and the world fell away. She woke to silence and snow. It had drifted halfway into the tunnel while she slept, but she was warm. The baby hadn't come, not yet. She wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. That day she moved deeper. There was an old cart track rusting in the dirt. She followed it by touch and memory, past collapsed beams and broken lanterns, deeper into the bones of the mountain. Each step felt like falling. The dark swallowed her whole, but she knew this place, knew the tunnels better than anyone left alive. He'd brought her here once, back when they still dreamed about building a home near the ridge. He showed her the side mud tunnel he said was the driest, showed her where the air stayed warm even in the freeze. She found it again on the third day, a hollowed-out chamber where the rock turned reddish and the air was thick with old smoke and silence. She lit the last of the candles from her pack and saw it still had the tin stove they'd dragged in years ago, back when he thought he could turn it into a workshop. It had rusted through at the base, but the pipe was intact and the walls around it hadn't caved. She cleared it with her hands, bare and raw for hours, dragged in blankets, dug a trench along the edge to drain the seep water, shoved rocks into the cracks to keep the cold wind from curling around her feet at night. Her belly dragged against the floor when she crawled, heavy and slow, but she didn't stop. Each day she grew weaker, but the mine grew stronger. And when the storm hit, the one that took out 3 cabins in the South Valley, the one that froze a family of 6 before they made it to the nearest barn, she heard nothing but the slow crack of her own fire and the soft, slow breath of the baby still inside her. But she wasn't safe yet, not even close. She knew it the moment the tracks outside showed up. Heavy boot prints, 3 pairs, and not from town. She hadn't heard them approach. That was the first thing that made her blood go cold. No sound of hoofbeats, no crunch of snow under boots, just the tracks, fresh and heavy, sunk deep in the slush near the mine's mouth, and the gut-deep knowing that someone had come looking. Not from town. Town folks didn't climb this high, not this far, and if they did, they never came quiet. 3 sets, all different sizes. One heavy, like a man built like a stove door. Another long and dragging, like someone walked with a limp. The third, small, tight steps, nervous, careful. A boy, maybe, or a woman who didn't trust the ground. Whoever they were, they didn't come with good intentions. No one came this way for good reasons. She crouched near the back of the chamber, hand over her belly, barely breathing. The old rusted pipe rattled once above her, just wind, but it felt like a cannon blast in the silence. She snuffed the fire and pressed her back to the wall. Cold soaked her bones again almost immediately. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might wake the baby. And for the first time since she'd entered that tunnel, she thought about running. But where? Out into the storm? Into the narrow crawlways that collapsed more often than they held? No, she'd be buried alive before she found another safe place like this one. So she stayed, waited. She heard them a few hours later, low voices bouncing through the tunnel like ghost murmurs, too warped to make out clearly, but unmistakably human. One of them coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and another cursed him quiet. She recognized that voice, rough, angry, the kind of man who'd rather shoot a dog than feed it. One of the drifters who used to work the tailings. He'd been kicked out of town months back after he pulled a knife on a boy over a sack of cornmeal. She felt the walls press tighter around her. There was only one way into the chamber. She rose, slow, bloodless fingers fumbling through the bundle she'd stashed under a broken plank. Found what she was looking for, a fire poker, bent but solid. Then a second thing, a small glass jar filled with kerosene. She'd planned to use it for the lamp, not anymore. Voices drew closer. She heard one say, "Thought you said she was dead." The other laughed low. "Not yet, but she will be." They were hunting her. Her, not food, not warmth. Her. Maybe they thought the mine was empty, or maybe someone in town had whispered too much, said the wrong thing over a drink. She didn't know. She didn't care. All that mattered now was keeping them from finding her, or the baby. The mine had kept her safe this long. It had swallowed men before. Maybe it could do it again. She moved like a shadow, keeping to the wall, stepping where the ground felt solid and the boards didn't groan. She reached the mouth of the side chamber and slipped out, back into the black artery of the main shaft. The air changed instantly, colder, more alive somehow, as if the mountain was watching. Their lanterns bobbed faintly in the dark, about 50 yards off. One held it high, another carried a rifle. She recognized him now. Bale, too, the drunk who'd once sold her husband a busted cartwheel and laughed when it collapsed the next day. He had a scar across his cheek from some old fight, and he walked like every step hurt. He wasn't dangerous by himself, but with 2 others, he didn't need to be. She waited until they passed the turnoff. Then she moved, back to the chamber, back to the stove. The fire was gone, but the embers still glowed. She dropped the jar into the ashes. It hissed but didn't ignite. She didn't wait, just grabbed her pack, her blanket, and the little parcel of dried meat she'd hidden under the floor rock, then crawled through the narrow slit behind the stove that led into the oldest part of the mine. It was a death tunnel. That's what they used to call it. No one used it after the second collapse. It dipped straight down for 10 feet, then narrowed to where even a child had to crawl. It was suffocating, wet, and full of bad air. But it also had a vent, an old crack in the stone that led all the way to the surface. Her husband had shown her that once, said, "If this place ever falls in, you go here. You keep your head down, and you crawl." She hadn't thought she'd need it. Not like this. She squeezed through, shoulder dragging against rock, belly pressed to the dirt. Every inch felt like miles, but she didn't stop until the chamber was behind her, until she heard Bale's voice again, louder this time, echoing through the mine. "She's here. I smell the fire." Then a crash, then silence, then screaming. The jar must have tipped over. The embers caught. She didn't look back, just curled into the narrow space, pulled the blanket tight around her and whispered, "Let the mountain take 'em." The smoke reached her about an hour later, thin at first, then thicker, but the vent above her held, pulling most of it upward. She stayed in that hole for half a day, unmoving, breathing slow, listening. No voices came again. When she finally emerged, the chamber was black, charred, but not destroyed. The fire hadn't spread far, just enough to burn what little they'd left behind and scare off any others who might come sniffing. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, her legs trembled so bad she could barely walk. Her hands were numb from the cold, but she kept moving, repaired the stove, resealed the vent, built a stone barricade over the chamber mouth so no one could see light from the main shaft. And then she rested, but not for long, because the baby was coming. It began with a pressure that stole her breath, then a pain so deep she thought her bones were cracking in half. She lit the lantern again, low and flickering, then laid herself down on the pallet of rags she'd made beside the stove. She had no one, no midwife, no clean sheets, just the warmth of the stone behind her, the smell of soot in her nose, and the endless churning fear that the baby would come wrong, that it wouldn't breathe, that she wouldn't. She fought every scream with her teeth clenched on leather. Hours passed like lifetimes. Sweat poured. Blood followed. The mine floor soaked it in, and when she finally cried out, when her voice broke and echoed through the stones, it wasn't just from the pain, it was because the child was silent, too silent. She turned it over in her arms, numb and weak, and rubbed its back hard, harder, nearly frantic. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on." Nothing. Then one gasp, then a cry, then two. She sank back, sobbing so hard she almost didn't feel the cold anymore. She wrapped him, in the last clean cloth she had, and pulled him close to her chest. She whispered his father's name, then her own. Then she said a third name, one no one had ever heard before, one no one in town would ever know, because they'd never see her again. She knew it now, knew it clear as the ice on the mine walls. The world outside had no place for her, no mercy, no warmth. But in here, in the belly of this mountain, she could build something different. Not a life of light and ease, but a hidden one, a warm one, a safe one. And that was enough. But survival wasn't guaranteed, because winter wasn't done with her, and neither was the town. The wind changed. She felt it in the rocks before she heard it in the shafts. A long, moaning tremble that pressed through the stone like the slow turning of some ancient key. The baby stirred against her chest, lips rooting gently even in sleep, but she didn't move to feed him yet. Her back was braced to the warmest spot along the inner wall. The stove had burned steady for hours, her final bundle of dry scraps slowly vanishing to ash. She watched the flame blink and flutter as the draft shifted, not just the weather. Something else, something outside. She pulled the baby tighter into the sling she'd fashioned from the same shawl that townsfolk had once given her with pity. The irony tasted bitter in her mouth. The very thing they'd handed her to mock her now kept her child from the cold. She pressed a hand to his tiny back, felt the rise and fall of his breath against her breastbone. Then she reached for the old pickaxe head she kept near the stove, rusted and dull but heavy enough to crack bone if it came to it. 3 days had passed since she gave birth. 3 long, shaking days where her body had tried to unravel from the inside. The bleeding hadn't stopped. Her legs still trembled when she stood too fast. Her hands refused to keep warm even near fire. But she hadn't died, and neither had the boy. That had to mean something. She moved slowly now, out of the chamber, and down the short bend to the main shaft, careful not to let the lantern flicker too high. The rock walls were damp with new melt, the snow outside softening just enough to seep through old seams and widen hairline cracks. But it was more than water that shifted the air. It was smoke. She smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke, sharp and dry. Not hers, someone else's. She doused the lantern and backed into the darkness, drawing the blanket over her face and the child's. Her heart pounded against the baby's cheek, and she knew he could feel it, knew he was learning her fear before he had words for it. They were coming again. Maybe not Bale, maybe not the others who tried her tunnel and never came back, but someone else, someone who hadn't learned, or someone who had. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in thick, wet sheets again. She knew the sound well now, the way it slid off stone in heavy clumps, the way it muffled every boot step, every wheel grind, every threat. It made the world feel empty, quiet, but it also made men bold. They thought they could creep up beneath the noise, that the weather would hide them like it hid her. But she wasn't the same woman anymore. She slipped back through the narrow shaft, took the baby with her this time, and retreated to the fire pit behind the second rockfall chamber. A hollowed-out vein her husband had once used to sleep in on long shifts. She'd sealed it with crates and old tarps, built a flap system for the vent, and stacked the far wall with packed snow and damp clay to reflect heat inward. The air back there stayed almost warm enough to breathe without seeing it fog. She'd only used it once since giving birth. Now it would have to do again. By nightfall, the smoke outside thickened. She could see the faintest orange flicker near the entrance. Someone had started a fire near the mine mouth. They weren't in the shaft yet, but they would be. Curiosity or desperation, it didn't matter. Someone had found her tracks, or saw the last of the smoke curling from her hidden vent pipe. Or maybe one of those men had escaped. Maybe they'd told. Maybe the town finally wanted to clean up the witch in the mountain. She heard voices again. This time, one of them was a woman. That made her pause. Not the shrill, judgmental kind, like the ones that had crossed the street when she passed through town months ago. This voice was low, steady, familiar in a way that stung. She shifted forward just enough to hear better. Her whole body was trembling now, not from cold, but from the tension that pulled her like wire strung too tight. "You sure this is where she went?" A man's voice, deeper, closer. "She ain't been to town. The dogs tracked her scent up this way. If she's alive, this is where she'd be." The woman's voice again. "If she's not, then we're wasting time while 2 more families freeze to death back at the river." Then silence, a long one, the kind that made her stomach twist. They weren't like the last ones. These people didn't sound drunk, didn't sound violent, but that didn't mean she could trust them. The town had never sent help before. Why now? The baby stirred. She hushed him gently, rocked him in the dark, barely breathing. Then came the sound she feared most. A knock, soft, echoing down the stone like something from a dream. Then a voice. "Ma'am," the woman called, her tone steady but not cruel. "If you're in there, we ain't here to hurt you." Silence. The baby's breath hitched. The woman tried again. "Name's Clara Rowan. I was the one who brought you stew last spring. You remember that?" She did. A faint memory. A steaming bowl in shaking hands. A woman who said nothing cruel, just left it on the step and walked off. She hadn't even looked her in the eyes, but she hadn't turned away either. Another voice joined. Older, rasping, probably the man. "There's sickness in the valley. One of the cabins collapsed. 2 boys are dead, and we saw the firelight. We thought maybe someone made it out. Maybe you knew something we didn't." Still, she didn't speak. Couldn't. Her throat was full of something she couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or worse, hope. She backed deeper into the tunnel, clutching the baby, weighing every possibility. If she stepped out, would they arrest her? Brand her a thief for hiding supplies in a mine no one owned? Call her unfit for keeping a baby underground? Would they even believe what she'd been through? But then the man said something else. "We brought food, medicine." And the woman added quieter, "We brought blankets for the baby." Her knees gave a little. That's when she realized she was crying. She hadn't cried when she birthed him, not when she burned the chamber, not even when she thought she might die alone in the dirt. But now that someone had spoken to her like she was real, like she mattered, she couldn't stop. She wiped her face hard, pulled herself upright, walked forward, not far, just to the bend, and then she spoke. "What makes you think I want your help?" The echo swallowed her voice, made it sound like someone else had said it, but it was hers. She felt it leave her chest like a bird breaking from a cage. The woman didn't flinch. "We don't, but we brought it anyway." Another long silence. Then, "I have a baby." The woman's voice softened. "We know. He ain't sick. He's strong. I made sure of it. I believe you. I won't let anyone take him." "Then we won't." The firelight shifted. One of them moved closer to the tunnel mouth. "I ain't going back," the widow said. "Not to the town. Not to that shack. You don't have to." The words didn't make sense at first. Then Clara said them again. "You don't have to. You made something up here. Somehow, against all odds. And we want to help you keep it." She blinked, felt the baby shift in her arms again, small and warm and impossibly alive. She stepped into the flicker of firelight. Her face was hollow, pale, but fierce. The woman who had crawled into this mine had died. What remained was someone harder, someone who could survive. Clara stepped forward, hand outstretched, not demanding, just offering. The widow didn't take it, but she didn't run either. She simply said, "No one else comes. No men, no preachers, no pity." Clara nodded. "And no one touches the stove but me." Again, a nod. The man behind Clara set down a crate. She saw the gleam of tin cans, the edge of wool, a small jar of something dark and sweet. She said nothing else, just turned and walked back into the tunnel, baby held high and close, cloak trailing behind her like a shadow that had finally stopped chasing her. The others followed slowly, quietly, like stepping into a cathedral, because they understood now. She hadn't just found a mine, she had built a refuge, and no one, not winter, not men, not God himself, was going to take it from her. The wind slammed again against the old vent shaft 3 days later, and this time it didn't howl, it screamed. The sound tore through the rock like a freight train dragging chains behind it, and the baby startled in her arms, letting out a shrill cry that echoed through the chamber walls. She clutched him tighter and whispered low to his ear, her own heart galloping in her chest, not just from the storm, but from the noise of voices outside. More voices, too many. That night Clara had come alone, with her brother behind her, and food in tow. The voices now were not like that. They didn't carry kindness in their tone. There was laughter, sharp words, a barked command, and then a louder sound, the crack of wood being pried apart. She stepped to the entrance slit of the chamber again, careful not to make noise on the old boards beneath her boots, and peered through the narrow split in the rock that looked back out toward the main shaft. She saw lanterns, 5, maybe 6, far more than before. One of them wore the long grey coat of a deputy. She recognized the shape of the rifle over his shoulder. Another had a wide-brimmed hat she'd seen before in the general store, back when her husband was still alive. Then she spotted the woman. It wasn't Clara. This one had pinched lips and an expensive cloak wrapped over her shoulders, trimmed with fur no one this deep into the mountains had any business affording. She didn't carry a weapon, but she didn't need one. Her face carried something heavier than a gun. It carried authority, town authority, and they were coming into the mine. She backed away from the crack in the rock, almost tripping over a stack of stones she'd piled to keep the heat in. The baby whimpered again, and she rocked him gently, faster than before, almost too fast, her lips tight and dry, her throat tight with the same breathless anger that had carried her through childbirth on a dirt floor and the burning of her last firewood without flinching. Not again. She wasn't going to lose this. This mine wasn't theirs. This warmth wasn't theirs. Her child was not theirs. They would not take him, not after everything. She pressed her palm to the cold wall and closed her eyes, listened to their boots coming closer, slow and uncertain. The deputies always walked like they were afraid of caves collapsing. That fear would work to her favor, but not if they found the tunnel mouth, not if they saw the heat she'd built up behind the stone barricade, not if they had orders to remove her. She went to the far end of the chamber and grabbed what remained of the sulfur lamp, its smell thick and bitter. She had 2 old jars of it left, the kind her husband had used back in the day to mark dangerous paths. She had kept them buried under broken crates just in case. Now was the case. She took the old canvas satchel, stuffed the jar and 2 tins of spoiled pork inside it, then wrapped the whole thing in damp cloth. It wasn't a bomb, not exactly, but it would burn if lit, and the smoke would choke out the tunnel good enough to drive off anyone who didn't know the airflow paths the way she did. She turned to the baby. He was quiet again, eyes wide open, staring at her like he already knew. "I'll be back," she whispered, tucking him into the corner cradle she'd carved into the rock wall with her own hands over the past weeks. She laid 2 stones over the flap and packed them with snow. Air would flow, cold wouldn't. She kissed his head once, then lit the jar and walked out. She moved fast, the flame casting long shadows that warped and danced against the rock walls. She didn't sneak, didn't crawl. She strode. They heard her before they saw her. "Who's there?" barked the deputy. "The one you came for," she called back. Her voice sounded iron, not cracked or soft, but like stone striking stone. The group froze as she stepped into the broader part of the shaft, a flickering shape draped in black, holding fire in one hand and a bag in the other. The woman in the fur cloak stepped forward first. "We were told you were sick, that you'd lost control, that you were putting others in danger." She laughed once, not cruelly, but like someone who finally hears a joke too late. "I've done more to survive than your whole valley. You freeze, you blame, you come up the mountain because I lived." The deputy raised a hand. "We didn't come to harm you. Then leave." "We can't." "Try." She dropped the satchel. The flame caught the cloth instantly. Blue smoke curled upward, biting the eyes. The woman gasped. The deputy cursed. 2 of the men backed away, coughing hard as the burning pork filled the air with a choking stench. Only the woman in the cloak didn't move. She just stared. "You'd poison us?" she said. "No. You poisoned yourselves the moment you came into my home." A loud crack behind her startled them all. It was the sound of the sidewall collapsing. The fire's heat had caught the old tar lining one of the beams. Not enough to burn the mine, but enough to throw smoke hard down the shaft, thick and fast. She turned and ran, slipping through the side chute she'd mapped weeks ago, one that bent back toward her sleeping chamber but avoided the main path. Only someone who knew the vent placements would survive without passing out. She had planned this, every inch of it, not because she thought they'd come, but because she She knew the world always does when you've got something warm it wants. She reached the cradle, pulled away the stones. The baby blinked up at her, still breathing, still safe. She held him, pressed him to her chest, and sat in the dark, the smoke curling past the seams of the wall far behind her. It took nearly an hour for the coughing to stop, then silence, then only the storm outside. No one came back, not that night, not the next day. When Clara returned the following evening, alone, she carried no lantern, just a wool bundle of cloth and a pot of boiled root stew. She waited at the mouth. "Can I speak with you?" she asked into the tunnel. Silence, then the sound of boots. The widow stepped into view, baby in one arm, the fire poker in the other. She didn't raise it, didn't threaten, just stood. Clara spoke without flinching. "They're not coming back. The council, they'll say the storm turned them around, that the mine was too dangerous, that they didn't find you, that you'd left. And what will you say?" Clara shrugged. "Same thing, and I'll keep bringing food." The widow's throat tightened. "You shouldn't?" "Probably not." Eben, it was her husband's middle name, and it fit. He was quiet sometimes, watchful, but he didn't blink at darkness, didn't startle when the vent shaft groaned. He had been born to this place, formed inside it. The mountain was his womb as much as hers had been, and she had begun to believe she could keep it going, that maybe, somehow, this was enough. But of course it never was, not for long. It began with Clara not showing up. One day passed, then two. By the third, she was pacing the tunnel mouth like an animal waiting for the scent of danger. She told herself not to. Panic. The path down was dangerous. Maybe the snow had blocked the ridge trail again. Maybe she'd slipped or stayed behind to care for someone sick. But by the fifth day, the fire in her stomach had become ice. On the sixth day, she packed the baby, now almost 2 months old, into the sling, wrapped both of them in every layer of warmth she had, her shawl, a fur from the crate, even scraps of scorched tarp tied with cord, and stepped out into the wind. She hadn't been outside since before the birth. The sky was iron grey. Clouds dragged low across the peaks. Snow fell in lazy spirals, thick as fists. It was like stepping onto another planet. The mine mouth behind her already looked like a wound sealed over. She almost turned back, but she didn't. She walked. Every step was a risk. Ice cracked beneath the snow. Drifts swallowed her legs. She moved slow, methodical, stopping only when Eben fussed or when the wind forced her to crouch low behind rocks. By dusk, she made it to the ridgeline above the valley, and what she saw made her knees buckle. Smoke, not the good kind, not chimney smoke, lazy and warm, black smoke, rising from 3 cabins. Charred beams jutted from snow like ribs. A barn had collapsed under ice. Its roof caved in. The trees along the path were snapped and burned at the edges. Raiders, or worse, desperate men from another town, come looking for warmth and not caring who froze in their place. She stayed low, waited for hours behind the ridge, hidden beneath an overhang of rock, watched, counted movements. There were 4 men moving through the ruins. One of them wore a coat she recognized, Clara's brother. Only he wasn't moving like himself. His limp was gone. He moved like a man with strength in his legs and fire in his gut. One who'd stolen more than just coats. She didn't cry, not even then. She only backed away, step by step, her fingers white around Eben, her heart thudding like a war drum in her ears. She didn't return to the mine, not yet. Instead, she took a path no one used anymore. The old creek route, half collapsed with snow and rock, but still passable if you knew the rhythm of it. Her husband had shown it to her once, back when he'd dreamed of digging out a second shaft entrance. And there, hidden beneath the roots of a twisted pine, she found what she needed. The cache. They had buried it years ago. Tin boxes of dry grain, a flare gun, blankets sealed in wax, and a small rifle with 12 bullets. He'd said it was just in case. Now it was the only case. She built a fire that night, deep in the hollow, fed Eben, ate 2 spoonfuls of cold beans, then slept with her hand on the rifle. She returned to the mine before dawn, crept through the back shaft, reset the stone barricade, and waited. For what, she didn't know. For the world to come back, for Clara to return, for her to finally collapse and not wake up. But what came instead was a sound, a slow knock, not at the mine, at the side. Tunnel vent shaft. Impossible. No one knew where that led. She froze, heart thundering. Then the knock came again. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. Another pause. 1 tap. She nearly dropped Eben. That was his signal. Her husband's. He used it when they met in the mines, when noise could mean a cave-in. It was their language. No one else knew it. She laid Eben in the cradle and crawled to the shaft, pressed her ear to the rock. "Do you remember me?" The voice was ragged, thin, barely more than a whisper. But hers, Clara, she was alive. The knock had been her idea of a signal. The widow moved fast, dragging back the stone plug, opening the narrow chute and hauling Clara in by the shoulders. She was half frozen, shaking with fever, lips split from cold. "They're gone," Clara said. "They came from the northern pass. Raiders. Took everything. Killed 3. I ran." The widow dragged her toward the fire, hands already working instinctively. Water, heat, a blanket. Eben stirred, but didn't cry, just watched. Clara's eyes were wild but steady. "They'll come this way next. If they find you, find him. They won't." "You don't know that." "I do," she said quietly, and in that moment she realized something had changed in her. She didn't fear death anymore, but she did fear losing what she had built. Not just Eben, not just the mine, but the possibility, the rare, terrible, beautiful chance that a woman like her could carve out something sacred from the dirt and ice and call it home. So she began to dig again, not a grave, not a tunnel, something different, a trap. She moved earth with her hands, hauled rock, built decoys, burned old crates to make smoke signs in a false shaft. She used the last of the flare gun shells to create a trigger line. If anyone stepped too deep, they'd light the mine up from the wrong end. She didn't plan to fight. She planned to disappear. When the raiders came 4 days later, just 2 of them left now, the others likely frozen or lost. They found nothing but burnt coals and wind-whipped ashes. No sign of life, no baby, no woman, no warmth. They stayed 10 minutes, then they left. Because sometimes the mountain doesn't need to kill you, it just needs to whisper that it could. Spring came slow. The thaw melted the high ridges first, then the trails, then the gulch. By the time Clara was strong enough to walk again, she and the widow had rebuilt the main chamber, reinforced the stove, and laid moss over the vent cracks to keep the damp from spreading. Eben stood now, tiny legs, wobbling like saplings in wind, but strong. He didn't cry when the wind howled anymore. He just looked at his mother and waited. And she, who had once been nameless in town, pitied, mocked, alone, stood now at the edge of her refuge and looked into the rising sun. She saw the valley below, knew they'd rebuild, knew they'd forget her. Let them. The mountain remembered. And as long as Eben grew strong and warm and unafraid, that was all that mattered. The mine, they would one day say, was cursed, that women went in and never came out, that it burned men alive, that no one could survive the winter in there. And they were right, because the woman who entered that mountain had died, and what came out of it was something stronger, something colder, and something far, far harder to kill.